This morning we're in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, as we continue kind of chronologically going through the Bible. And it's interesting today, especially and somewhat emotional today, because Romans 8:28, and we'll read the whole verse in a moment, it's a promise from God. Okay, it's a guarantee from God. But it's one that so often is misunderstood and misapplied. God's going to make everything work, and we tend to bring that inward. God is going to make my life perfect. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. That's not what he promised. That's not what he guarantees. And so as I talk about these things working for good and describing the promise, at the end of the service, I've got to make a couple of announcements and prayers about illnesses within the body that kind of frustrate me today. Because on one hand, I'm going to talk about this great promise. On the other hand, I'm going to talk about some not so great facts of life. So I hope today you'll listen and take from this the vision: God will make all things work for good in his kingdom, not necessarily my life. He will use my life for good. God is not going to unduly punish me to make good happen. But God's promise doesn't say that he makes all things work together for me to have a perfect, healthy, wealthy, wonderful life. Now, let me give you an example of things working to good. I don't know about you, but I like a little bit of salt on my food. I'm Southern. I mean, I had country ham a couple mornings ago, and you've not had salt till you've had a real Southern country ham. Now, if you think about salt, it's made up of sodium. Taken by itself, it's poison. It's made up of chloride. Taken by itself, it's poison. But combined, does wonders on food. Totally changes the taste profile of food that we eat. So God can take bad things and transform them into good things. So this morning we're going to look at 5 things about God's promise that I hope you will look at as a way of giving you hope when things don't always seem hopeful. Let's start with the scripture and then we'll move forward.
All right, this morning's reading will come from Romans 8, verses 28 through 30. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, and that he may be firstborn among those brothers. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified.
I want us to look at a couple of parts of this verse before we get into the lesson. First, the very first thing, because he knew you were going to become of one of his children, he predestined or pre-chose you to be changed to look like his Son. I want you to put a marker on that one. Put a little tab there. Because we're going to think at some point about what his Son did and looked like before his death, so that he would do God's will. Also, he said you're going to be his firstborn child. Now, we try not to show preference, but that firstborn, I can really go out on the limb. I only have one born. But that firstborn is the best of all of them. See, I get away with that today. You know, the firstborn grandchild, the firstborn child, the first daughter, those are great things. And he called us. And because he called us, he made us just. He justified us. And because he justified us, he uses us to be glorified. So let's start there with our lesson. And I want you to look at the first thing is the certainty of God's promise. We know. We know that when God makes a promise, he is not like man, that he will forget or violate, go back on his promise. We have all made promises in life, I know, that we didn't mean to go back on it, but for whatever reason, we messed up. We tried very hard in our house with grandkids who are all lawyers already, apparently, not to say, I promise. Because the minute you say, I promise, then you better not vary from that. I don't care if a blizzard and a tornado come at the same time. You cannot skip that movie now. So God says, I promise. It's locked. It's in stone. It cannot change for any reason. Psalm chapter 89, verse 34, he says, my covenant I will not, and look at the word he uses here in Hebrew, violate it. He could have said, my promise, I won't change it. That's softer. My promise, I won't have to say I will not violate this promise I've given you. Nor will I alter one part of it. I won't alter it. I'm not going to change it. It's done. It's set in stone. In Numbers 23, God is not a man that he would lie to us, nor a son of man that he would have to say, I'm sorry for anything. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? When God gives you a promise, count on it. Take it to the bank. We need to understand that when we start this study today, that God has said, I promise you that I'm going to make good things happen here. I promise you. We can take great comfort when we know something is guaranteed. I like rules. I like boundaries. I get out of sorts when I get outside of my boundaries with it. You know, I've said before, I was a little bit of an adrenaline junkie. I like to do crazy things when I was young and could do them. But I also knew there were rules. There were laws of physics that you didn't break those laws of physics when you were rock climbing unless you had mechanical help that would ensure you could break that law of physics. Like ropes that stretched only a certain percentage and then sprang back. Scuba tanks, you knew at what depth you had so much time on your tank. And you could count on that. I misjudged it one time. It was not a pleasant experience. You know, you know how long you can be down at what depth. God says, you don't have to figure out any rules that go with this. My promise is locked in stone. I won't change it. I won't divert from it. Now, God does say this. There are consequences to actions. Different sermon for a different day. God's promise does not say, so go out and do whatever you want and I still cover you. I don't think so. If you want to reference this, go ask Jeff Gifford afterwards. So can I just burn down my house today and your fire insurance is still going to cover me? He's going to laugh. And then he's going to call the police to meet you at home. That's called arson. There's consequences to sin. But for today's lesson, a promise to his children is guaranteed. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. From before you were born, God says, I have a plan for, fill in your name in this blank right here. I have a plan for you, Jeff, from before you were born. I know that as I take stock of my life at times, I see where God has interacted and interjected himself and people he chose to shape my life to where I am today. As a teenager, if you had said you'll stand in front of a crowd 2 or 3 times a week and you'll preach and you'll teach, I'd have laughed at you. Because believe it or not, I didn't like to talk in those days. I No. I didn't. I was very quiet, and I kind of stammered and stuttered. Hated to be in front of people. But God worked things slowly and surely to change my life to do what he wanted me to do. And slowly and surely my life changed to want to do what God wanted for me. Until that became, as Paul said, a passion, a drive. I'd love for you after church today, not right now in the middle of my sermon, I can tell when you're not thinking with me. I want you to take stock of your life and say, how has God worked in my life to point me in a direction? If you're not where you think God wants you to be, then take stock on what you can do to fulfill your half of it. Because God's not going to drag you kicking and screaming in a direction you don't want to go. But if you will alter your course, he's there to help you. I promise. Next, let's look at the completeness of his promise. We know that all things work together. All things. All is everything. All doesn't leave anything out. All things work together. Now, God's methods can seem a little strange to us sometimes. I'll give you that. You know, there's things that have happened as I take stock of my life and I say, now I see it, but God, I sure didn't understand what you were doing me in those days. I didn't get it. I mean, so, look, and we'll look at an example in a minute. First, he gives you the test. Well, Lord, okay, clearly you didn't take education classes in college because they teach you first, they show you how it's going to work, and then they give you a test. You got it backwards, Lord. No, God says, I'm going to give you a test, then I'm going to teach you what lesson I wanted you to learn from it. Okay? I wasn't a great student. I would have definitely failed this way. I came close the other way. And then thirdly, he says, I'm going to help you to learn. Great, Lord, through affliction. Not so great, Lord. Let's look at an example. What about Joseph? Now remember Joseph? Kids, if you don't know the name from right now from the get-go, ask your parents to read you this Bible story when you get home. It's wonderful. But poor old Joseph, you know, he was a dreamer. And he would tell his family about, you won't believe the dream I had. You're going to all bow down to me someday. And Dad loves me better than he loves you. It's a given. So, you know, his brothers started talking bad about him. And then one day they decided, let's just throw him in a well and leave him to die. And then about that time, here comes a caravan of traders. Better yet, we can make money off his death. Let's sell him as a slave. Nice brothers. Then later on, as as things are starting to seem to work for his good, and he's rising up above his stage as a slave and into a leadership position in this king's home, he's accused of rape and lied about. I mean, he was totally innocent. He's thrown in prison. And while he's in prison, he starts doing some things in a godly way again. And eventually, he is meeting with his brothers because he is selling them grain in the midst of the worst famine the world has ever known and probably ever will know. And his brothers come there not knowing who it is they're buying from. And when they figure it out, he says this, you meant evil against me, but God meant it to turn out good in order to bring about today's results. Why? To preserve his people, God's chosen ones, alive. So, you know, we're a reporter and we're sitting there talking to Joseph and say, Joseph, how was the bottom of the well, man? Kind of damp, kind of scary. What was it like those first few weeks being drug along behind a caravan? Kind of scary. How was it being sold on an auction block as a slave? Really scary. How was it to be accused of rape and thrown into prison? I was innocent. So Joseph, why do you have a smile on your face? Because God made me part of saving my descendants. I don't know, as I look at my life today, if I can be accused of or take credit for any part of saving my descendants. But I sure hope someday God reveals what all He's done for me. And I hope He reveals what He's done with me in your lives and the lives of your children and your grandchildren. I hope. That's my prayer. And then we look at the cause of God's promises. You know, the literal translation of this verse from Greek is that God works all things together for good. Notice something's missing in this translation. God doesn't work all things get good for me. God works all things together for good. Who's good? God says, me. That's right. He reads my notes ahead of time. He gives me my echo. He's just a little ahead today. God says He works all things together for God's good. God's kingdom's good. And that's good for me because I'm part of His kingdom. I'll give you a hint. Today, if you are chosen to die a martyr for God's kingdom, if you're chosen to be like the majority of the disciples, hung, beheaded, whatever it is still working out for good. Today we study, today specifically we studied people who God says, I know this has been a trial. I know it's been terrible, but guess what? Your children are going to reap the promise of you becoming faithful again. Their fields will be full. They won't suffer. They'll get ahead financially again. Not you. It's not coming for 70 years. You know, if Jeremiah got up and is preaching that sermon, and I'm sitting in the audience and I'm about 80 years old. So, excuse me, you said 7, right? I think I can make 7. Nope, 70. God works all. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. We have obtained an inheritance, and we were pre-chosen according to God's purposes, who works all things after His own advice. God knows what's going to happen. God's chosen you to make those things happen. And so He uses you to ensure those things can happen. It can be as little as today. There could be someone that you're going to bump into that is having a terrible time. And God may have set you up to run into them to provide some sort of blessing in their life, whether it's a smile or whatever it is. But if you choose not to be a blessing today to other people, then His purpose was not worked. Now, if that person is seeking God, He will make it work in the end. But He wants you to be a part of that today. He wants you, and you know, you never know. So, you know, we're working on this charity out of Forston that I've mentioned before, Believe in the Children. And Friday, I was there when the sign company came to put the new sign on the front of the building. And the guy, you know, I walked out and I'm standing back. I'm not really looking at him. I'm looking at the job he's doing. And thank goodness I was not being critical. Because he turned around and says, I know you. You train dogs. Okay, so fine. Dog place got the glory from it. And then he said, but you're a preacher too. Yeah, I've heard about you. I'm glad I wasn't critical. Even though there was a dot where I didn't think it belonged, but we worked that out. No. We don't know who we're going to run into that when we're good to them and godly and loving and kind and blessing later on. Now, is something going to change in that man's life? I don't know. But at least I did my part towards changing his life if he's willing someday. We don't know. So let's look at the cause of God's promise. God is not dead. I don't care what the world tells you today. Recent study just came out. About 68 or 70% of all Christians believe that there is a God and there is a heaven. Interesting to be called a Christian and not be that 30 or to be that 30%. But anyway, they believe that heaven is real and God is real. But only about 40%, 48% of Christians believe that hell is real. There is no Satan. There is no hell. Doesn't make sense. God is not dead. He is alive. He is well. And he is working things to his glory and his purpose. He's not sick. He's sometimes sick and tired of us, but he's not sick. He's not too worn out to do what it is God does. It is God who made this promise. God is the cause of the promise. Okay, I will work all things together for, Jeff interjection, my good, says God. God is working. God has a plan. We just don't get to see the end of it. I love the fact that we can really dish on Israel, can't we? Boy, we're studying Jeremiah and say, what kind of people, would build a golden calf within days of getting all those blessings? I mean, they walked out of slavery with so much gold they could barely carry it. He gave them manna. He gave them quail. He gave them water. What kind of idiots are these? I'm sorry. I should be nicer. But they were idiots. What kind of people say, we're not going to take the land when they have just walked with God leading them with fire and a huge cloud? What kind of people? The same kind of people, sorry, but that are sitting here today that God gives you blessings and then you go and do something terrible. God is still alive and well in your life today, and he is visible if you will look for him. Watch him at work. God even says, try me in some of these things. Try me, test me. See if I won't. Uh-oh. And the promise is conditional. Now, I kind of led off with this, and we're going to come back to this for a moment. The promise is conditional. First, here's the conditions. Because, Adam Gerber says he's looking at a truck. Yeah, I'm talking about you. Adam Gerber says he's looking at a truck. Okay, so they're not just going to hand him keys and say, well, congratulations, you've got a truck. They're going to make him sign some conditions. Like, I don't know, pay for it. Put insurance on it until you do pay for it. So there are conditions to this promise. One, you must love God. And if you love God, you will, the Bible says, keep his commandments. If you love God, you will love your neighbor. He's got conditions. He expects you to do some things. Not loving God, okay, so there's an inverse to this equation. Not loving God says, one, you don't love him, and two, leaves you out of his promises. When you act, walk, talk, whatever, in a way that says, I don't love you, God. I don't care what I say at church on Sunday. I don't care what my friends think. I don't care what anybody says. God knows, and when you do that, he says, then I have no responsibility to cover you by this promise. What you do in darkness, what you do in secret is seen by God. You can tell me anything. You can try your best to convince me of anything, but God knows. That's why when somebody tells me something and I believe it not to be true, I have a clear conscience. Because whether it's true or not, God knows. And once I've preached it, done my part of this job. I can face him with a clear conscience. Matthew 22:37. You will love your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. That's everything. Heart, soul, and mind. That's everything. That's giving God everything. So then God, if this was the certainty, all things work together for good. God, if this was the completeness of it, if this was the condition of it, if this was the cause of it, if this was then what's the purpose? Why are you doing this? To glorify God. I make you this promise so that when good things happen, you'll glorify me. And I make you this promise so that when seemingly bad things happen, you'll glorify me. And I make this promise so that when you can't tell the difference in good and bad, or the reason, that you'll trust me, that someday it'll be okay. It will have worked out. There's a reason for it. Nothing glorifies God more than our recognition that his hand provides everything. There is nothing God doesn't provide. My mom called this last week. Well, my wife knew it apparently days before I did, but my great aunt died. And you would have thought it was a comedy routine, because when I called my mother and I said, how's it going? Well, your Aunt Jean died. Oh, no. What'd she die of? 97? Oh, that's not what I meant. She goes, well, that's what she died of, 97. Could have been 98. Wasn't 96. It was 97. Okay, Mom. Anyway, Mom came to me and she said, the thing I'm struggling with is your aunt was baptized in the same creek that the rest of us were. The same little country church that our family went to for 120-something years. But when your aunt got married and left home, she never went back to the church. And I never heard her say a bad word. I never saw her do a bad thing. But what's God going to do? And I said, here's the thing, Mom. It's not my job to worry about that. I said, it's only my job to pray and to hope and to beg God for grace and mercy in starting with my life and the life of those I love. And I leave it to him because I don't know the outcome. Don't come to me and ask me the outcome of somebody you know or somebody you care. I can't answer the question. It's not I'm being evasive. I can't answer the question. Because all I know about God's grace, love, and mercy is what he taught me. And I hope it's a lot broader than the conservative me thinks it might be. I hope it is. But all I know is what he told me, and that's all I can tell you. And that's all I will tell you. No false hope. No false pretenses. Psalm 115:1. Not to us, O God, but to your name give glory, because of your loving kindness and because of your truth. I don't want any glory, God. I don't want any praise. I don't want any recognition. I quite honestly can tell you I have no aspirations of becoming a famous TV preacher. I have no aspirations of a congregation of 10,000. Be cool, but only for once. I don't want to do that every week. I just want to preach God's word to whoever he sets down in front of me. That's all I want. And all you should aspire to is to do things that gives God glory in your workplace, in your home, in your school, in your daycare, wherever it is. Give God the glory. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who have been called according to his purpose. God is so good. God is so good to us. He's so good to me. He's so good to you. So here's the question. What is the good that all things are working together for? Well, I'm glad you asked. I heard you thinking. The good is this: to make us more like Jesus. That's all. To make us more like Jesus. To be conformed into the image of his Son. There's no higher purpose in your life than to be like Christ. Today, I hope this helped. Because I know, go back to my opening statement, I know in reality some of you are facing difficulties. Maybe it's financial. You just can't hardly make it paycheck to paycheck. I get that. And in fact, sometimes I've been there with you. We didn't make it from paycheck to paycheck. Maybe it's health issues, and you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. Maybe it's life decisions. I happen to know some farmer says he's going to retire. I don't believe it till I see it. But, maybe it's life decisions, and that can be stressful. Maybe it's just the unknown that drives us crazy. God says, I will make all things work together for good if you love me. I believe it. I trust it. I live in that promise. And I hope you will too. If we can help you in any way, please come while together we stand and while we sing.